not where she could see everything.
Okay, did everyone have a good lunch? Are you full enough? Before we introduce Bruce, let's thank our teenage helpers. They did such a good job today. We honestly don't know what we'd do without them. And thank you to Mike for stepping in and being Doc today. We really appreciate that. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So this afternoon, Bruce Boertje is going to talk about the history of Pella churches. Is that right? So let's welcome Bruce this afternoon.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me back again this year. I really enjoyed my time here last year, and does it need to be a little louder? All right. All right.
Eleanor, I'm looking at you.
Yeah, I'll watch Eleanor. So, but it's good to see so many familiar faces here too. So it's really fun to get together with all of you and get to share a little bit of Pella's history. It's one of my passions. Well, probably my biggest passion. But before I start, I just want to let you know today is a very special day, not just because we're having a meal here, but 35 years ago, almost to the minute, Cindy and I got married. This is our 35th anniversary. And it was a beautiful day, just like today. It was about 60 degrees and sunny out. So anyway, I'm going to talk to, like Lori said today, a little bit about some of the history of Scolte, of Pella, and some of the early religion in Pella, and how some of this came to be. So hope you can stick with me. And if you have questions, if something I say isn't clear, let me know. And certainly afterwards there'll be time for some questions and comments too. So with that, I'm going to get started, and I want to tell you just a little bit about Scolte. Originally, I had planned to go more in depth on Scolte, but there's so much information I can only pack into a little bit of time. But Scolte was born in 1805 in Amsterdam. He was born and raised a Lutheran, which might surprise some people. His grandfather immigrated from Germany and started a box-making factory. They sold boxes to the sugar refiners because of the Dutch East Indies. There was a lot of sugar brought into the Netherlands, and they sold boxes to the refineries. And over time, Scholte's father took over the business, and Scholte's grandfather came to live with the family. They were living in Amsterdam, and at age 16, when Scolte was 16, his father died. And so it was just his grandfather, who was by then was living with the Scholtes, and Scholte's mother and his brother to run the company. Scholte's brother was younger than he, so it was probably mostly left up to Domi Scolte and his mother. But within 6 years, by the time Scolte was 21, all the rest of his family had passed away. His grandfather died a few years before, and then his mother and his brother died in the same year in 1926. And Scolte was left alone with the business. And Scolte inherited all the family estate. So the family was fairly well-to-do, at least upper middle class. And Scolte inherited 40,000 guilders, which would be $16,000 today, which maybe doesn't sound like a lot, but that's 200 years ago. And so that was a considerable amount of money, and that did not include their house or the business. So Scolte was fairly wealthy as a young man. He was 21. And a lot of people, they were 21 and were rich probably probably would go off and live a life of leisure. But Schulte had the drive and determination. He decided he wanted to go to seminary and become a minister. And so he did. He went, he studied, he was a voracious reader. He loved to debate. By all accounts, he was a very charismatic person. Even later in life, people that didn't like him as detractors would even say, nobody can preach like Schulte can. So that was the one thing. He was always able to rally people around him and had a very magnetic personality. But, so I'm going to skip ahead now to the time when Schulte came with about 800 Dutch immigrants. They settled in this area. So, oh, by the way, I did want to mention too that the pencil sketch on the left of Schulte is one that we found in the Schulte house. I was helping catalog some of Schulte's books, and we came across this sketch in one of the books. And Schulte was a very good artist. In fact, early in life, he thought maybe that's what he wanted to do. And so we don't know for sure, but I kind of think this may be a self-portrait of Schulte. So I just think it's really cool. So this is a map of Marion County, the way it looks today. The red rectangle in the upper right-hand corner is the area where most of the Dutch settled. So Marion County was organized in 1845, Iowa became a state in 1846, and the Dutch arrived in 1847. So they were here very early on. And like I said, just keep in mind this section in red. It's 6 miles wide, 12 miles high, so it's equivalent of 2 townships today. But on the next slide here, this is a map that was drawn by Henry Hospers. Henry was 17 years old when he came over with Schulte, and in fact he worked for Schulte as a surveyor. So Henry drew this map, and it was included in a booklet that Schulte had printed and sent back to the Netherlands called The First Voice from Pella. But what's interesting about this, can you see the dots, the red and the blue dots on there? Those indicate the locations of cabins in the area at the time when Schulte came. The ones in red were cabins and land that Schulte was able to purchase for the Dutch settlers, and the ones in blue are cabins of American settlers that remained in the area. So it was a good mix of both Dutch settlers and Americans. And it was very important for the Dutch to purchase these claims. None of the land in Iowa was yet strictly for sale from the government. You could come and stake a claim, you could file your claim with the government, but you couldn't actually purchase the land yet. But Schulte, what they did, he and 4 or 5 other people went around to the settlers, asked if they were willing to sell everything they owned. They would pay them gold for their claim, but they needed to buy the land, they needed to buy the crops, because when they came, they brought very little with them other than the gold. So they bought the crops, the livestock, the homes, the land claims, and that was what kind of got the Dutch through the first year so they could get going. So we're going to focus on Pella as that little red rectangle. That's what was originally platted as Pella. And inside there you can see just a tiny little blue square. And that is what this map depicts. Within 2 weeks of arriving in Pella, Schulte had the county surveyor come over and lay out 9 blocks. And so what you see is the public square in the center, which today is Central Park, and the 8 blocks that surround it. And each of those blocks had 8 lots on there. So they could start selling lots so people could build, because if you don't know where your streets are, where your lot lines are, it's just chaos. So that was the very first thing they did, was had that surveyed so people could start buying lots. Now there was a log cabin standing in Central Park, which is that little brown square in the center. That's where Schulte lived for 6 months. But he immediately had hired American workmen to start building what's now the Schulte house across the street to the north. That's that outlined rectangle. And the other thing he did was, there, you see that rectangle to the left, that solid little rectangle, was a community building. They started working on that immediately, and that was to be home to their church, to their school, and a public meeting house. So that was completed in November. In about March of 48, so the first spring that they were here. So originally they held worship services outdoors, but as soon as that meeting house was completed, they started meeting there. And on the next slide, got a sketch of what we think it may have looked like. It was a 25 by 50 foot wooden structure. There's no real photographs or paintings of what it really looked like. This is just somebody's idea. But the Christian Church of Pella was organized that for the first full year that the Dutch were here. And it was an independent, non-denominational congregation. It had no pastor. Schulte was not the pastor. It had teaching elders who would preach if they had that gift. And they had elders and deacons, but the consistory was the entire congregation of the church. So it was essentially a congregationalist church. Any decision that needed to be made was voted on by the entire congregation, which was the consistory. So this continued for about 3 years. The first years in Pella were pretty hard. Everybody was trying to get their feet on the ground, just trying to get their homes built and get established. So people got along pretty well. But by about 1851, well, I guess before we get to that, I did want to just throw this in. It's a really cool painting. It was done by Gerhard Nollen, who was not in Pella at the time. This supposedly depicts Pella in 1848 when it was 1 year old. Gerhard did not actually live here yet then, but he came a few years later, and I think he balanced what Pella looked like then with what the description of what people gave him. And if you look in the center left, you can see the Schulte house in the distance. It's that one with a little spire on it. And then this view is from the west looking down Washington Street. So there wasn't a whole lot to see, but it's still, I think it's really fun to get a little bit of an idea of what Pella looked like. So before we get too far, these are some of the buildings that I'm going to be talking about. I don't expect you to remember all of them, but it's kind of nice to just have a general idea of where things were located. And part of what I find interesting is that everything is so compact. Everything in here is in a 3 block by 3 block grid. So 9 square blocks, and just about everything we're going to be talking about is located in this area. So this is from an 1869 map. And by the way, I have a copy of that map up here. If anybody wants to come look at it afterwards, you're welcome to do that. And probably a lot of you have seen this before too. But, so want to start out just kind of highlighting some of the buildings. The Schulte House in the top left, which was completed in the spring of 1848. And then we talked about the Christian Church of Pella, the school meeting house and church building is that Christian church on the far left in the middle. And then in 1855, Schulte built his own church. We'll get to that, but that's at the lower left there. And then in the bottom center, you see the original First Reformed church location. And when First Reformed built a new church, it was just across the street on the same lot where we are now. Second Reformed is where Second Reformed is still. Third Reformed church we're going to talk about, that's where the public library is. The Presbyterian church site in 1869, that building did not yet exist. That's this one right here, but we're going to talk about that because that's eventually where Second Christian Reformed wound up locating. And then I think the most interesting one is the little brick church up on top. So this is located where the Village Cleaners is today on East First Street, so between Bredo and the Chinese restaurant. And we're going to refer to this little brick church probably 4 or 5 different times because it played a role in the beginning of so many churches in Pella. So, in fact, we're going to get to the little brick church right now. So this was in 1851. A portion of the Christian church, they had a split, and I don't know, it was maybe a third of the congregation left and started worshiping independently. And I think they felt like they should be more aligned with the Reformed church from the Netherlands than what the Christian church was here. And so they started meeting independently, and in 1852, they built this little brick church. Now, there's no other drawings or photographs or anything of it that I've seen anywhere else, so sometimes you just have to be happy if you have anything to look at. But so First Reformed Church got their start there, and after First Reformed, then first held their first Sunday school classes there. Second Reformed Church got their start there. Third Reformed Church got their start there. And in between times, it was used as a school. So the building was demolished in 1878. It only stood for 26 years, but it really played a fairly big role. And we'll talk about it from time to time through the rest of the program. So 1854, this is kind of when the beginnings of First Church probably came about. There was a large issue in the church. As you can see, there was a lawsuit, the Christian Church at Pella versus Scolte. So Scolte had a plat laid out of Pella, and this just shows you the Garden Square, which is Central Park, and the block to the west, which today is where like the old Carnegie Beersen Library is. And then you see that little brown rectangle is also where the Christian Church building was located. But originally, Scolte kind of had planned that this would be the church square. And now I should mention that all the land in Pella proper originates with Scolte. When the settler, the Dutch immigrants came, they didn't have enough money to buy up all the land they needed. So since Scolte was fairly wealthy, he used some of his own money to buy land. And part of the land that he bought was what became Pella. So if anybody has an abstract, owns property in Pella, if you look it up, it'll go back first to the federal government, and going to the state, and then to Scolte. And from there on out, it'll list who else has owned that. So Scolte owned all the land. Scolte held the deed to all these properties. So originally, Scolte had thought he would have a church square located next to Central Park. But as Pella grew, more businesses were starting to congregate around the center of Pella. Originally, they were kind of spread out along the main road in and out of Pella. But after 7 years, it looked like that businesses were going to start, like I said, sprouting up around the square. And that was kind of the American way. So Scolte thought, well, I could better use this for businesses, and I will give the church some other land to build on. Well, that didn't sit well with the rest of the church. They immediately went back to Scolte and said, you have no right to do this. And he said, well, yes, I do. I own the deed to the land. They said, no, it says right on the map, it says Church Square. And so they went to court, had a lawsuit against Scolte, went to the county court, and they ruled that Scolte still owned it, and then it got appealed, went all the way to the Iowa Supreme Court, and eventually was upheld. It just, it did in fact belong to Scolte. So in the meantime, the Christian Church people have been coming to Scolte and saying, look, you've got to give this back, and he wouldn't, so they finally suspended him from preaching in the church. And then they came to see him a couple more times, and then he finally said, you don't need to come see me anymore, because I'm not going to change my mind. So with that, Scolte was out of the Christian church, and when he left, about half of that Christian church congregation left with him. And they went, and first, for a while, Scolte preached in a barn in South Pella, and eventually he started constructing his own Scolte church on West First Street, which, if you remember, was on the left side of that map. And we'll get more to that later, but I just kind of wanted to say that this is where the whole separation of that original congregation, which at one time had been so unified, was now split. So what else was going on in Pella? At that same time, in 1854, the Central University of Iowa was founded. This was founded by the Baptists. Scolte and a few other local people had worked and lobbied long and hard to get the Baptists to locate their university in Pella, and that came to be. And in 1854, it opened. They had started the foundation. This was going to be their building, the one on the right. But in 1854, it was nowhere near ready to be used. So they had to find a temporary location, and they found that building on the left, which still stands today. It's on West Washington Street. It used to be part of the Strawtown Inn complex. And I think it's a Ameriprise or something. There's a financial group in there now, but that building still exists. But anyway, so Central operated out of that building for 2 years. They started out just as an academy, which was kind of a high school / preparatory, because Pella had no high school at that time. Nobody really had high schools. So nobody was qualified to enter a collegiate level of study at the college, so they had to start the academy, which, like I said, was a 3-year preparatory course, so people could worked through there in order to become educated enough to go to the university. And we'll get back to that in a little bit. So in 1855 was an incredibly busy year for Schulte. He teamed up with a gentleman from Newton. His name was Edmund Grant, and they built this printing office, the picture you see on the left, and they started publishing the Pella Gazette newspaper. This was the first newspaper published in Marion County and the westernmost newspaper in the state. And they published this together for 5 years. And at the same time, they opened up banking services. They operated as land agents and insurance agents. This is a flyer of Schulte and Grant that came from the picture from the Central College archives. They unfortunately still have one. And also in 1855, Pella was big enough that the city could be incorporated. Pella could become a true city. And I found it really interesting in the first election of city officials that the mayor they elected was an American, William Ellis, and sometime I have to ask Jerry Ellis if he's a descendant of him. I don't know, I assume Ellis is a fairly common name, but I thought it was interesting that 4 of the 10 elected officials were Americans. In fact, 3 of the 6 aldermen, which are city council people. So it shows that it didn't take long and Pella was already fairly well integrated. In the summer of 1855, in July in fact, Schulte's church was completed. Schulte built this church at his own expense, and he continued to preach there the rest of his life. He preached there at no cost to the congregation. So this is the oldest picture I've seen of the Schulte church, and it's partially hidden by there's a beautiful brick house in front, which I wish that house was still around. It looks really cool. But this is where Schulte continued to preach for the rest of his life. So we have a couple views of what Pella looked like in 1856. This one is another painting from Gerhard Nollen. And one of Nollen's brothers married one of Schulte's daughters, too, by the way. The Nollens were a very prominent family. One of them went on to, I think, be president of principal in Des Moines, and one of them was head of Grinnell College, and there was Gerhard, who was the well-known painter, so very prominent family. But this is a picture of the north side of the square. So on the left, the White House you see is the Schulte House. And on the far right is the printing building that Schulte and Grant had built. And in between that little red and white house, I think was probably home to Benjamin Keebles. He was a doctor that came to Pella when Pella was just a couple years old. He'd walked from Burlington to Pella with $20 in his pocket, opened up a medical practice, and within a year he'd married Schulte's oldest daughter. And Keebles was very prominent. He served as a surgeon in the Civil War, and he was very connected with Central College as well. And I kind of think that it may be largely due to Keebles that Central College was placed here, because Keebles was a Baptist, and I'm guessing he might have lobbied long and hard for Schulte to help with that. So, sorry, that's an aside. I tend to wander at times, but there's so many interesting little tidbits. So, and another view of Pella from the south. So if you were standing south of Pella looking north, this is another painting from 1856, and there'd been a lot of activity going on. The Schulte Church, which was just 1 year old, you can kind of see off in the distance on the left, and Park School, way in the distance, but there's another picture of Park School up here, opened in 1856. This was Pella's first purpose-built school building. It was located right next to where the post office is now, in the parking lot and part of the house next to it. And in this picture, it's been doubled in size, but originally the big addition was on the back, so the front always looked like this. It was really, I think, a very handsome-looking school. And then Central University in 1856 was able to move into their building. They had one room on the 3rd floor that was finished enough that they could move into there. So for 1 year, they only had the academy. They had been having a primary or a grade school too, but they dispensed with that for a year. And then the next year, they started their collegiate department. And the Baptists were then also busy finishing a room on the 1st floor of the Central's building, which was to be a chapel, so that the Baptists could worship there as well as the Central students. And then here on the far right is the Washington Mill that just opened in 1856. That was the first mill in Pella that was a grist mill, so people could get their grain ground before they would have to travel to the Skunk River, probably almost over to Oskaloosa to get get grain ground. So this was a big improvement. So also in 1856, we have Schulte, the year before, had left the Christian church. And so what was left of the congregation had written to Michigan and to the classis. At that time, it was part of Michigan classis, the Reformed churches were, and they were inquiring as to what options they might have if they were thinking of possibly joining the Reformed Church in America denomination. And Van Raalte, I could do a whole hour on him too, but he was a contemporary of Schulte. In fact, Schulte had ordained Van Raalte. Back in the Netherlands, they had seceded from the Dutch Reformed Church, and Van Raalte had been a close friend of Schulte. In fact, there was what they called the Schulte Club. There was like 7 people that were all ministers and were involved in the Schulte Club. Schulte was kind of the leader. He was the oldest, but he also had the personality to pull these people together. And Van Raalte, his father had been a Reformed church pastor, and Van Raalte wanted in the worst way to be ordained into the Dutch Reformed Church. But he was the only one in the Schulte Club that they refused to ordain, because by that time the rest of them were causing enough problems and seceding. So Van Raalte was ordained into the seceded Dutch church. And Van Raalte came to America just 6 months before Schulte did. Originally, they'd planned to kind of come over together at the same time and possibly to settle in Wisconsin. But Van Raalte got here late in the year. It was, I think it was like October or November. And when they landed in New York, they took a boat across the Great Lakes. They landed in Detroit, and that was as far as they could get. So Van Raalte went off exploring land, found some on the opposite side, and founded Holland, Michigan there eventually. But his group did not have as much money as Schulte did. And his group, Van Raalte, kind of unilaterally made the decision to join the Reformed Church in America, which some were fine with and some were not. But he just kind of made that decision. But so anyway, where this comes in is that Van Raalte was very involved with the Reformed Church. So Classis, Michigan sent him to Pella to meet with the Christian church congregation. And within a week, they had decided that they would become the Protestant Dutch Reformed Church of Pella, and they were organized and incorporated as such. And at that time, those that had seceded earlier and built that little brick church came back, kind of rejoined the organization, and then they had that leftover little brick church, so they said, well, we're going to deed this back to you. So we had both the wooden church building and the little brick church, and now we had 2 sort of congregations, because most of the congregation decided to join the Reformed Church, but there were still some that remained with the Christian Church of Pella, the little independent church. So the little brick church was given to, I'm just going to call it First Reformed, because that wasn't really their name yet, but that's who they became, and it's just easier than saying Protestant Dutch Reformed Church of Pella. So First Reformed got the little brick church, and the rest of them stayed in the little wooden church. And the First Reformed Church was needing a pastor, so they called Van Raalte, and Van Raalte turned them down. In fact, they called Van Raalte 3 times. The first church went 3 years without a pastor, and after Van Raalte, like I said, had turned them down 3 times, they called a couple pastors from the Netherlands. One of them refused once, and another one refused twice. And then they called Van Raalte's son-in-law, Peter Ogle, and he refused, but we're going to get to that in just a minute, because eventually Ogle did accept. But in the meantime, the Baptists in Pella had started building a church, and there's a guy, Comer van Sticht, wrote a history of Pella in 1897, and he wrote that this building was considered colossal at the time. So. And this is sometimes referred to as the Pink Church, but it's also the church that the Baptists built and then sold to First Reformed. So the church was not completed yet when the Baptists sold it. The Baptists, like everybody else, had a split, and they split into First Baptist and Second Baptist, and neither one was big enough or had enough money to finish the building. So they knew that First Reformed was needing a bigger place, and so this building was sold to First Reformed, and this became the first church building of First Reformed. And then on the map, you can kind of see where it was located. So it's really just across the street south and on the opposite corner from where we are right now. So this served as their building. Now, we get back to Peter Ogle. So this is Veneralty's son-in-law, who had been called twice now. And so to try and help their cause, the Pella contingency sent a committee to Michigan to meet and lobby both the classes and also Ogle himself. And finally, Ogle agreed to come and was installed in Pella in 1860. And he only stayed here 3 years, but he was apparently a very good minister. Scolte even spoke very highly of his preaching, so that probably says a lot. But in the meantime, so Veneralty had come back to Pella in 1859. He spent 5 weeks here, and at that time he set up the first Reformed Sunday school in Pella, which met in the little brick church. And then Veneralty came back again in 1861, a year after his son-in-law was installed here. And then he set up a parochial school. First Reformed had their own parochial school for about 4 or 5 years. So it didn't last, but it's interesting that they were able to make that work. And Veneralty, in fact, had planned to also have a Reformed university in Pella, which obviously never came about. But in 1863, Ogle, his health was not great, and he left and went back to Michigan. And then Pella, First Reformed, was without a minister again for another 3 years. So in the meantime, what was left of the Christian church congregation erected a new building, and this may look familiar. This building still stands. This is where Pella Books is today. It's located north across the street from the post office, kind of catty-cornered. And this is the oldest existing church building in Pella. And we'll circle back to this one a little bit too. So now we come to Second Reformed Church. In 1862, Reverend Abraham Thompson came to Pella as part of the Board of Missions. There was talk of wanting to set up an English-speaking Reformed church in Pella. One of the problems that they foresaw happening is that as a lot of the Dutch students were in school, they were learning English, and they were afraid that as those students got older, that they wouldn't stay with the Dutch Reformed Church, that they would either go to the Baptist or the Methodist Church. So they thought they needed an English-speaking church, and Reverend Thompson helped organize that. In 1863, they set the cornerstone for the building, and in 1865, it was far enough along that they could move in. And then 3 years after that, 1868, the Dutch Protestant Reformed Church of Pella changed its name. We officially became First Reformed Church. So actually, I think we had a Second Reformed Church before we had a First Reformed Church in name. In March of 1866, First Reformed, finally, after 3 years being vacant, got another minister. He was Reverend Egbert Winter, and it sounds like an American name, but he was actually born in the Netherlands, came to the U.S. when he was 15 years old. So he was a pretty adept English speaker, but he stayed at First Church for 18 years. He was here until 1884. And in fact, at the time, in 84, when he had another call, he told First Church that he would stay if they would agree to switch their services over to English, because he felt it was that important. But the church wasn't quite ready to do that yet, so he left. And so 1866, the first year when Winter was here, in August of that year, 42 members from First Reformed left to form the true Dutch Reformed Church, which a lot of you know is the Christian Reformed Church. And in a lot of ways, I think the Christian Reformed Church is truer to the Netherlands Reformed Church than what the Reformed Church in America is. So I think that's part of the attraction. They're a little more orthodox. And then also that year, from First Church, several members left to form the Bethel Church. So First Church was kind of leading people off left and right, but their numbers always stayed high. So this is a picture of the Bethel Church here on the right. That was located north of Pella, near the Skunk River. In 1868, Dominic Scolte died. He was 62 years old, so not too old, but he had a heart attack, and that was the end of him. And his church, because it did not belong to any denomination, was not able to fall back on any pulpit supplies or anything like that. So they kind of struggled. I don't think they really had a succession in line for what would happen. I don't think Schulte was planning on going anywhere quite so quickly, but sometimes plans change. And so they kind of struggled along as an independent church for a while, but by 1870, they decided that they would join the Reformed Church. And so Schulte's church became the Fourth Reformed Church in Pella. And that same year in 1868, Third Reformed Church was organized. So it was said a goodly number of the First Reformed people left to go form the Third Reformed. So I don't know if there was a little bit of difference in what was going on. But Third Reformed was formed. They met in the Little Brick Church at first. And then in 1870, they purchased this building from the Methodists. The Methodists could do an hour on them too. This was actually the third church building they'd built in Pella, and they'd only been here just like 10 years. And this building wasn't finished. They apparently had a dispute with a contractor and said that's it, and washed their hands of it. So Third bought it and finished it, and then the Methodists immediately went and started building a fourth church. So they were certainly busy building churches. But the other thing that happened in 1870 is that Henry Hospers left Pella. So if you remember, Henry was the 17-year-old that drew that map for Schulte. By this time was mayor of Pella and publisher of the Pella Weekblad, a Dutch newspaper in Pella. And there were about 60 families from Pella that left to go homestead in northwest Iowa. They formed Orange City, and in fact, Hospers is a town up there, is named after Henry Hospers. So in 1872, the Presbyterian Church was constructed. That's this church building you see here. And so this one is north across the street from where El Charros is. If you know where Verduft Agency is, anybody there? Verduft's on the alley. This church was on the other side of the alley from where Verduft is. And it faced to the south. So the Presbyterian Church was organized in 1869. It only lasted 10 years. It disbanded in 1879. And also in 1872, what was left of the Schulte family left Fourth Reformed Church. And so at that time, that meant that his wife Maria, who had remarried Robert Beard, and then Schulte's two sons, David and Henry, had left the Fourth Reformed Church, and they started a Brethren Church, which some people call a Darbyist Church, but it's similar. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. I'm sorry, I'm kind of stumbling around, but it's a church that doesn't normally have ministers. They may have traveling ministers that come from time to time, but they would take turns. Beard and the Schulte sons would take turns preaching, and they conducted a lot of the funerals there. So they bought this building in 1884, and they held on to it until 1897, when it did eventually become the Second Christian Reformed Church. So, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. In 1872, First Reformed Church, even though they'd spun off so many churches, was growing. They outgrew the church building they had. And in fact, in 1869 already, they started raising funds and building this church. It was built mostly with volunteer labor from the congregation. And it was kind of a pay-as-you-go deal too. So it took about 3 years, but finally in 1872, it was finished enough to move in. And you can see it, and some of you may remember seeing pictures where it's got a spire on top, and so it obviously wasn't quite finished yet when this picture was taken. But starting in 1876, the original First Reformed Church building was used as Pella's first opera house. So for 8 years, until the building burnt down, it was the opera house. In fact, you see a little handbill there in the center, entertainment at the Opera House on Christmas Day, 1880. So our opera house downtown that's built in 1900 was not our first one. It was actually the building that was First Reformed Churches that became the first opera house. So in 1879, we're jumping ahead a little, the Fourth Reformed congregation that's meeting in Schulte's church decided they were going to leave the Reformed Church in America, and they became an independent church for about a year. And this was the same year that the Pella Presbyterian congregation became inactive. And that building for a while too was used as kind of a community center. There were concerts held there, there were meetings and speeches, a lot of political speeches, and I found an interesting article in, I think it was April of 1879, a Central graduate came and spoke every night in this church for a week on the topic of phrenology. And some of you maybe have heard of phrenology, so let me read you exactly in case you don't know what phrenology is. But it's the pseudoscience of studying the skull's shape and bumps to predict a person's mental traits and character. So a Central student spent a week, and he could pull in enough people that he could lecture for a week on phrenology. So another useless tidbit, but it's still interesting, I think. So in 1880, Scholte's old church, the former Fourth Reformed, decided to join the Holland Presbyterian denomination. So this was a Dutch-speaking faction of the Presbyterian church. Yeah, it's convoluted. Yeah. So they stayed with the Holland Presbyterian denomination for 14 years until 1894. And I thought it was interesting. There was actually a second Holland Presbyterian church in the area. There was a Howell Holland Presbyterian, so south of town, Howell Station. Some of you have heard of that. It used to be an old railroad station. But there was a small congregation started down there in 1893. It was discontinued after 1 year. But it still had 20 members, according to the Senate data that I found. So it said discontinued, but 20 communicant members. So I thought, well, it's still, I don't know, it had a sizable number of people for a while anyway. Another, just here or there. But, so 1894. So this is when the Pella Holland Presbyterian returns to the Fourth Reformed denomination. So after 14 years of being Holland Presbyterian, yeah, they came back to the Fourth Reformed. So, and at that time, they had been without a pastor now. So by May of 1895, been about a year and a half without a pastor. And this Ryer Vanderkieft and his family arrived from the Netherlands. And Ryer had been a preaching elder in the Netherlands, and he was not an ordained minister. But within 2 weeks of his arriving in Pella, the Fourth Reformed had already engaged him to preach for 6 months for them. So in just 2 weeks' time, they'd gotten to know him well enough to think that he was somebody they wanted to have around. So he was not sanctioned by the RCA, but he was just an independent preacher. So after his 6 months were up, then they wanted to renew his 6 months, so, which they did. And he was very popular. The next year, in 1896, they had almost 200 communicants in that church. That was the highest number they'd had. Scolte at one time had around 175 to 200 communicants. But this guy was really popular. I mean, the 200 probably wasn't as many as First Church, many members as First had, but it was way more than Second had, and probably about what Third had at that time. So he was very popular. So the Fourth Reformed, part of it's like 83 of their members voted to request to classis that they give Vanderkieft a dispensation and just declare him an ordained minister. And the Reformed Church said, no, we can't do that. We've got our standards, and you've got to have this certain training and classes before you can become a minister. So it didn't sit well, and in July, a fair amount of the congregation voted to ask the RCA if they could leave and return to the Holland Presbyterian denomination because they thought it would be easier to get Vanderkieft ordained as a minister. And the RCA said, no, they said, look, just a year and a half ago, you wanted to come join us and you had a lot of good reasons, and now you want to leave just so you can ordain one person? They said, no, that's not going to happen. And so that didn't sit well. So this is where things started getting kind of interesting. So yeah, I see the headline, Fraud, Conspiracy, and Collusion. That's exactly what happened. So on October 12th, 7 of the 8 consistory members met in secret. The 8th of the consistory members didn't know anything about it, and he was not in favor of this, so that's obviously why he wasn't invited. But 7 of them got together, and they signed the deed for the church and the parsonage over to an individual. His name was Jan Ackerman. And what they thought was they would sign the church to him, and then they would vote to leave the RCA, and then that guy would sell the church and parsonage back to them, and then the rest of what was left of the Fourth Reformed would be kind of out in the cold. So it seemed like a good plan. And in fact, the very next day, they had a congregational meeting. So this was kind of a hastily called congregational meeting, and not near everybody was there. A lot of people didn't know about it, and maybe the ones they didn't want there were not notified. But at this meeting, they agreed, we're going to sell the whole thing. They said, they had a few debts, which weren't big, but they said, well, that'll be our justification. We'll say we're going to pay off our debts, we're going to sell everything. Well, the rest of the church knew nothing about this. So as soon as they found out, they went to court and got an injunction. The church was locked, so nobody could use it. So for several months, the church sat locked. In November, Classis had a special emergency meeting in Pella, and they invited Vanderkeeft and all the dissenting members to attend and give their side, but they refused to do that. So Classis eventually voted that the Fourth Reformed congregation still existed, those that hadn't wanted to secede, and that the building, in their opinion, still belonged to the Fourth Reformed. And then they advised them to elect a new consistory to replace the 7 of the 8 consistory members that were committing the fraud, conspiracy, and collusion. So the matter headed to court. A court date was set for February. And so I was reading through, there was extensive notes on this whole court case that were in the abstract to the house that now sits on the site of the Scolte Church. And I just found this interesting. Lawyers haven't changed at all, because there was a note in there that the case was continued until April, because it said, and this is a quote, numerous, voluminous, and sundry pleadings filed, and the cause was continued. So I always had kind of a fun way of wording things back then. So the church building's locked, so neither faction could meet in it. So the Fourth Reformed, what was left of Scholte's congregation, were meeting in the former Christian church building. So in that little brick, the Pella Books church building is where, and by this time, that church was owned by First Reformed Church. It was used as a chapel. But anyway, Fourth Reformed was allowed to meet there. And then the Vanderkeeft seceders were meeting in the City Hall, which is now the old fire station. So they were meeting upstairs in there. And in April, then finally the Vanderkeeft faction voted to purchase the old Presbyterian/Grace Church. So this is the one by El Charo. So they purchased that, and they moved in, and then finally Fourth Reformed was allowed to go back into the old Scolte Church building. But the court case still hadn't been decided. And then to complicate matters even more, Jan Ackerman, the one that they'd given the deed to, up and died in July, and so they then, instead of dealing with one person, he had 8 heirs. So every time there was a court case or anything had to be done, they had to get all 8 of those people together. And this is in time before telephones or anything, so it was, gathering of them from. So they had a hard time getting this case settled. But on August 17th, the Second Christian Reformed Church was accepted into the CRC denomination, and they formed with 51 communicant members. And at that same time, according to the Synod data, Fourth Reformed had 54 members. So if you remember, just 1 year before, they had almost 200 members, and now between the two, they could barely scrape up half of that. So they lost a lot of members going through all this. In October, the court case was finally decided, and it was ruled that Fourth Reformed, the original Fourth Reformed congregation, as they said, their allegations have been proven, and they are the owner of the church building and parsonage. So the next year in 1898, Elder Friar Vanderkeeft of the Second Christian Reformed Church finally passed his final examination and was ordained and installed as pastor of the Second Christian Reformed Church. And he continued his ministry there until 1907. So he spent about 9 years there before he left and took a call in Grant, Michigan. And in the meantime, from 1898 to 1909, Fourth Reformed finally back in their building, but they kind of struggled along, and they had 4 different pastors that had come and gone during that time, and actually their pulpit was vacant quite a bit at the time too. And their congregant members was never large. It fluctuated between 39 and 60. And so sadly, in 1909, they voted first to sell off the parsonage. And on the left is an ad that appeared in the Chronicle for the sale of the parsonage. And this is the only picture I've ever seen of the parsonage, and sadly it's from the back. It'd be fun to see the front, but you can really see what it looked like. And this was taken probably right around that time, maybe just a couple years. It could have been a few years after it was sold, but it gives you a little idea what it looked like. And then no more had they sold the parsonage than the congregation voted unanimously to sell the church and property, and they left the RCA. They disbanded. So on January 11, 1910, at 2 o'clock was the final sale, and I just think it's kind of sad to read through that ad and see, they listed the pulpit furniture, the pulpit Bible, the psalm books, the Sunday school supplies. They sold it all, and that was essentially the end of Scholte's church. Now the building stood for another 5 years, till 1916, and it was used kind of on and off as part-time as a skating rink, and the high school used it for some parties, sometimes like the juniors would host the sophomores and that type of thing. But the person that owned it refused to let any political rallies or speeches occur there. And there was a time where I think his First Reformed was remodeling their church building, and so they did meet in this building for a while too. But in 1916, it was sold to a man named John Bosfold, who wanted to build a house on that site, and he had the church dismantled and built a house there. And today, there are 2 houses standing on that site. The one in the center, the green one, was built by John Bosfeld, and then the house to its right. Both those stand on the site where the Schulte Church was, so they kind of straddle the area where the Schulte Church originally was. But I've always heard rumors that some of the lumber from the Schulte Church was maybe used in one or both of these houses, and I think it turns out to be true. Jim Warden, who owns that greenhouse now, sent me these pictures, and these are timbers from the basement, and you can see from the square cutouts and where that arrow is, you can see a round hole where the wood pegs were driven through. So obviously this is lumber repurposed from an old building, and it would certainly make sense that it would be from the Schulte Church. And you can see kind of from the saw blade, it's pretty rough cut material. So no way to prove it for sure, but it seems very likely that some of the lumber from Schulte's church is still in use. So I'm getting close to the end. I just had a couple other photos I wanted to share with you. This one I thought was really interesting. On the left is the First Reformed Church, and off to the right is First Church's parsonage, which was a wonderful, spectacular building. And you can, looking at it in comparison to the other houses around, it was a big house. And these are 2 pictures of the parsonage. And the parsonage was replaced in 1912. I'm not sure why, because it couldn't have been more than probably 40 years old. But they tore down this beautiful house and built a wooden frame house on the same site. In fact, it's the exact same dimensions. I'm not so sure that it may be built on the same foundation. The only difference is this house, the brick house, faced the south, and the later house, which still stands, faces Broadway, so to the east. And I think this is a really interesting photo too. And part of it's neat because it was taken from the steeple of First Reformed Church, and it looks northwest. And here, clear on the right, you can see the Schulte Church, or the Fourth Reformed, or the Holland Presbyterian, whichever you want to call it. The parsonage is down here in the lower right. Up in the top center, you can see the water tower that used to be in West Market Park. That was Pella's first water tower. It was built in the 1890s, torn down in 1923. And then you can see First Christian Reformed Church to the left. And in the center, you can see the house that is today the Van Dyke Dubin Funeral Home. So, and especially if you look at the second story of that, you can look at it and say, oh yeah, that's definitely the Van Dyke Dubin home. So, Glenda, I don't know if you've seen this photo before or not.
No, I haven't, but I picked it out.
Yeah, I think it's a really neat photo. So I'm going to circle back to what became of that little brick church that we talked so much about. So it was torn down in 1878, but in 1932, I ran across this article in the newspaper, and it said the building, talking about that church, because it had also been used as a school, was later torn down, and the bricks used in constructing a house, which stands about 2 blocks east of the old location. And this house at 909 East 3rd is still there, is exactly 2 blocks straight east of that location. And in fact, I used to think, well, it could be, it might be, it might not be. there's a 1931 map, so at the same time this article was written, there's a 1931 fire insurance map of Pella, and it shows all the buildings, and it shows whether they're wood or brick construction. And this is the only house that's of brick construction within at least a 1-block radius of it. So I now feel almost positive that some, if not all, of the brick in this house came from that little brick church. So again, I don't know, doesn't, the grand scheme of things doesn't mean a whole lot, but I think it's interesting. So I just had one last slide here of Domini Scolti and his gravesite. When he died, they built a vault for him. So he's actually buried in an underground vault, and you can kind of see off to the left, there were some stones that kind of covered the opening to the vault. That's since been covered over, although I think you can see maybe a little bit of those stones still if you look in the right place. But anyway, that's Scolti's final resting place. And this has been just a little taste of history. There's so much rich history in Pella, but hopefully you learned a little something, or at least found it a little bit entertaining. So, and if anybody has any questions or comments, I'd be glad to answer those too. Yeah, Lori? Yeah.
So Bruce, we were told when we were getting tours of the house that First Reformed Church was the first RCA church this side of the Mississippi. Is that correct?
I don't know that for a fact, but that seems possible. There could have been something around Burlington, maybe. I don't know. There was a Dutch settlement around Burlington, and I don't know if they ever had a Reformed church there. Well, yes, yeah, that's true. It was the oldest existing. That part was true. Now, whether it was the first one, though, I don't know. So it's always in how you word things a little bit. Yeah.
The little church that we know as Scolti Church on the Historical
Yeah.
Society, where did it come from and what was it originally?
So that was built, it's a replica, it's a scaled down replica of Scolti's church, and it was built in 1976. So it was the country's, centennial, what do you call it? Yeah, 200th anniversary. So it was built new. There had been nothing on that corner for a while, so the Historical Society.
His pulpit's in there though.
Yes, Scolti's pulpit is now located in there, that's true. And then there's a house behind there is a replica of the Beerson House, which stood on Main Street too, and that's kind of a neat house. It also is a scaled down replica, but that's where that came from. Yeah.
I was surprised to see that Dominique wasn't the first mayor.
Yeah, I know. It would seem kind of a logical thing, but yeah. And not only was it not Scolti, but not even a Dutchman. So yeah, I thought so. Oh, she was surprised that number one that Scolti hadn't been the original mayor of Pella, and not so it's like I said, not only was it not Scolti, it wasn't even a Dutchman. Yeah. Yeah, he was involved in so many things, and I think there was some hard feelings between some people, partly because he had a lot of money and he acted as banker, but he loaned a lot of money to people too, and I think his heart was in the right place. The thing with Scolti, he was always the smartest person around, and even in Holland, he'd been imprisoned once for preaching to more than 19 people, and he spent a week in prison, and he went to court and he defended himself and he won, and it kept getting appealed higher and higher, and as his own attorney he kept winning. And in fact, Scolti's biographer says that all of Holland owes Scolti a debt because he said no one knew the Constitution better than Scolti. He was that smart, and he was, like I said earlier, a voracious reader. In fact, when he moved to America, he had to sell off like 80% of his books. It was like 4,000 or 5,000 books, and even what he brought here, he still had hundreds, if not 1,000 books, and it was books. Some of them were 200 years old, and some were history, and some were law, philosophy, politics.
He has a copy of the Torah from the 1500s. We were also told that he donated the first piece of property to what is Central College
Yep.
and sat on their board till his death. Is that
Yeah, he donated 2 blocks for the college to be built on. Then he also donated 2 extra blocks, which were to be sold, and then the proceeds from those sales were to benefit the college. And then I think he gave him some additional, I don't know, money or property or something. But, well, I think there was some property out of town he also gave him. But, yeah, and then, yeah, Schulte was the first president of the Board of Trustees of Central College, and I don't know for sure if he served on it his whole life or not. He may have. His son-in-law,
Well, he died so unexpectedly soon, you know.
his son-in-law, that Benjamin Keebles I talked about, did serve on, and Keebles lived into the 1900s. And when he died in the Chronicle, the Central College Board of Trustees wrote that Central has never suffered a bigger loss than when Benjamin Keebles died. So, that really says a lot.
Bruce, 2 questions. Go ahead.
No, but-
Anything else? Okay. Across from Trinity Church.
Yeah.
We had Protestant Reformed for a while, a little brown church, where our daughter-in-law's father served as the pastor. They weren't like the Protestant Reformed Episcopalian method.
Yeah.
They were always a Protestant, I don't know, you know, it's not there anymore, they lasted a while.
Yeah,
They
and
weren't Christian Reformed,
right.
they were Protestant.
Yeah, and Reformed, it doesn't necessarily denote a particular denomination. I mean, for us, especially in Pella, we're used to Reformed Church and Christian Reformed Church, but there's other denominations that have been reformed through the years.
We did know that he was commissioned from Michigan. Their roots were in Michigan, but then, yeah, it dissolved completely, I guess. But I don't think that didn't evolve from any of this, did it?
I don't think so. I don't know, it gets so convoluted and
And you had,
complicated.
okay, so you mentioned Presbyterians, you mentioned Baptists, you mentioned Methodists. Were these all people that were moving in? They weren't people that broke away from,
So.
or was it a combination?
So the Baptists and the Methodists were already in the area before the Dutch arrived. In fact, it was a it was a Baptist minister, Moses Post, that led Schulte and the initial committee of investigation to this site and recommended this site for Schulte to settle on. And he had been a Baptist minister in the Iowa Territory for probably a decade and had traveled through this area and knew a lot of the people here and actually introduced some Schulte and that band to some of the pioneers, like the Tuttle family, for instance. So yeah, Baptists and Methodists have been here all along. They probably not in large numbers, and in fact, the Baptists didn't have a church in Pella until Central was organized. They had met south of Pella about 3 or 4 miles in I think the Nosman cabin.
And we talk about Schulte donating, he donated a lot of land to the men that were in the service.
He did, yes. Yeah, up to the Civil War veterans. There was a number of lots, I don't know, 60 or 70, I think, at least in North Pella. And ironically, none of them were ever used. A lot of them were lost due to taxes not being paid on them. But yeah, Schulte did, like I said, there's a number of veterans that he made that offer. And in the same way, so we're gonna go off in the weeds again, but a lot of the area where the Dutch settled north of Pella was due to veterans from the Mexican-American War. They were militiamen from Kentucky, and they were each given 160 acres for having been in the service. But because they were so far away, I don't think too many of them were interested in moving to the wilds of Iowa. So what they did, they sold those, they were called warrants at that time, land warrants. And there was a man named John Graham who bought all those. I think there was 52 total. It was over 10,000 acres. And he turned around and sold those all to Schulte for, it was $8,320. So it came out to $1.25 an acre. And that was actually the going government price for land at that time. But this John Graham is a bit of a mystery because Schulte, in the bill of sale he wrote out when he paid Graham, he said John Graham of Indiana, but I don't know how Schulte would have met this guy. Eventually John Graham became mayor of Keokuk, but again, I don't know where their paths crossed. I don't know how Graham contacted 52 veterans from Kentucky to buy their warrants, and then how he in turn turned around and sold them to Schulte. Because there were certainly land speculators at the time that bought up as much land as they could and then sold them at a lot higher prices. But Graham didn't do that. This was the only time Graham bought land. So, I don't know, it's a mystery. Something I work on from time to time.
Is the little Gospel Hall Church still in operation?
Yes, it's got about 3 families, I think. And I think they're all in their 80s or... No, well, but they were one of those that didn't really have ministers. They would have people kind of rotate through. And so, yeah, some of the preservationists in town are a little concerned what's going to happen to that Gospel Hall church building when they disband.
When I used to
Because it,
go out to church, there were quite a few people that went there.
yeah, there was at one time.
We used to play Bible school in the summer.
Really?
Community, yeah, because we used to go there just, because any kid could come and, have Kool-Aid and cookies and free pencil.
Cool, and a free pencil.
But was it called Gospel Hall?
Yeah, Gospel Hall, yeah. And first, I think it's Gospel Chapel for a while, then they switched to Gospel Hall. I don't know what the difference is, but if you look in the papers, it was called one thing one time.
Did you find out, remember the first, when we were growing up, that Catholic church, that white one that was by Central College?
Before their newer one.
Yeah.
Before the Peace Street one.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, they had that, Catholics had that for about a century.
Okay.
And it's interesting, Schulte was not a fan of Catholics. In fact, he made the stipulation when they emigrated from the Netherlands that no Roman Catholics could come with him. But I think part of it was, Schulte was, by that time, deathly opposed to hierarchy in church organizations, which is why he didn't even believe in pastors or consistories, let alone denominations. He thought that there was no biblical basis for that, and Schulte was a very biblical person, and he just believed everybody was on the same plane. And so Catholics having a pope in charge of everybody and then bishops under that was just something that Schulte couldn't abide. And I think also Schulte had some premillennial leanings. He was thinking the end times were coming, and he was quite certain that anything that was associated with the Roman Empire was probably doomed. And so, again, the Roman Catholic Church he wanted nothing to do with.
But Dominique was an ordained minister, right?
Yes, Dominique was ordained into the Netherlands, the state Dutch Reformed Church.
And that was recognized here as the same level.
Yeah, well, so the Reformed Church in America is a little different, is a little more progressive than the Netherlands church was. So I'm guessing they probably would recognize ministers, but the Reformed Church in America was started 200 years here before Schulte even came. It started in the 1600s. So I don't know. There's
Lots of.
yeah. There's
There was a picture with a mill in the background with smoke.
yeah.
Where was that?
So that was on University Street. It would be between East 2nd and East 3rd on the south side of University. So, and in fact, there was 2 mills there, just down the block from that. It wasn't shown in this picture yet, but there's one called the Pearl Mill. It was smaller, but they both operated at the same time for a while.
It's funny, because you think, oh, everybody came and they just got along, everybody went to church, and they just had such a good time.
Some things never change, so yeah. Yeah.
What was really interesting was back then, all the ministers went back to Michigan, just like they're doing today.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I think the Midwest back interaction of the Reformed Church was quite a bit different, even today, I think, than the East Coast, than the older, more established. But I think the Midwest was more Orthodox probably than what the Eastern.
Shirley just asked if Liar Vanderkeef was related
Yeah.
to Henry, and that was his dad's great uncle.
There's a lot of Vanderkeefs, but yeah, seem like they're almost all related somehow. So. Yeah, Vanderkeef had a big part to play in some of this. So. He was a busy
We heard
guy.
lots of stories about that.
Anybody else? Vernon.
I'm curious, when the town of Amsterdam was set up in the Des Moines River bottom
Yep.
until the flood got their attention, was there ever denomination established in that little town before they came into Pella?
So Vernon is asking about the town of Amsterdam, which was platted on the Des Moines River. And that, I was originally had some information on that in here, and I kept chucking stuff left and right because I knew it was going to be too much and too long. But one of the reasons that Schulte wanted to settle here is because of its proximity to the Des Moines River. And there was, the federal government had passed what was called the Des Moines River Lands Grant a year before the Dutch arrived here. And that was supposed to install 28 dams and 9 locks on the Mississippi River to make it navigable all the way from Keokuk up to Fort Des Moines. And the idea was they'd set every other section of land for a 5-mile radius on either side of the Des Moines River in reserve. And so that I was going to kind of explain why Pella is exactly where it is. And part of that was because a lot of these sections were not available for purchase. But that was, anyway, where I was going with that is they were going to develop the Des Moines River, and Schulte had planted a town called Amsterdam. And there were he sold lots there. There were some houses and a few businesses established there. There was a brick kiln down there too, where a lot of the buildings in Pella were made from brick from there in the very early years. But by 1851, so it's only less than 4 years, in 1851 they had a really bad flood that washed everything away. And the Des Moines River Lands Grant thing never really panned out. Eventually they wound up giving the remaining money to the Des Moines Valley Railroad, and that came through Pella in 1864, arrived in Pella. So really, that was a better deal. But at the time, when Schulte arrived here, water was the only transportation, essentially, that they had, and that's what the Dutch knew, too, was water transportation. So it obviously had an appeal to Schulte. But I don't think that there was ever any churches established in Amsterdam that I'm aware of. That I think that was kind of your question, so.
Yep. That's probably one of the better things that happened. It was devastating, but then the town of Pella got out of that bottom, which is probably a good choice.
Yeah, that Des Moines River, it took them a long time to tame it. And the town of Red Rock, it was washed away more than once. And that was kind of the end of it finally too. Because for a while, it was a pretty going town, but every time it would flood, houses would get washed away. Anybody else? All right, otherwise, thank you so much for your attention.
So, I don't know about you, but he's got enough information, I think we'll ask him next year too.
I better start working on something.
I hope you all had a good time. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for
so much.
inviting me.
And next month, the second Monday of the month in December, we'll have our December program. We'll be upstairs to start, and Darwin and Judy are going to do an organ and piano duet for us for that. That is also the month that we bring potluck coffee time. So we'll have a cart setting up by the door, and you bring your potluck coffee time, and we'll get it down here. Because go ahead and invite friends to come and stuff. I think they're gonna really enjoy Darwin and Judy that day. So, thank you all for coming. Have a good rest of